Good afternoon, welcome to another A-Push video with Mr. Pate for Barlow High School. Today we're looking at sectional conflict, and our essential question for today is, why did Southerners continue to pursue more territory? Because that's what we're going to see after the Mexican-American War. As we saw in the last video, Northerners were already outraged over the massive gains in the South while they felt they'd been robbed of half of 5440 essentially in the Oregon country. But now we're going to see divisions harden, and we're going to see kind of an out of control train lurching, just sailing, going as full speed ahead toward the Civil War as the South continues to try and gain more territory. And you see right now the extent, here's Missouri jutting up, here's Texas in the west, of slave territory, slave states in the United States. But the question becomes, after the Mexican-American War, what's going to happen to this territory out to the west? And that's where we begin. The Wilmot Proviso. Now let's keep in mind that the House of Representatives was controlled by the North, and the Senate was even. And we'd seen this was a reason for delay with Texas. It resulted in the Missouri Compromise with Missouri and Maine. It was very important to the South to keep this balance. And yet they're going to give it up soon and forever after not have it. So what happens? The Wilmot Proviso, Northerners in the Whigs in the House of Representatives twice are going to pass what they call the Wilmot Proviso that says no territory gained from Mexico, which would be part of Texas, but a Texas slave state, Utah and New Mexico territories, and California, that none of that would be open to slavery. Well, this is going to be problematic in the minds of the Southerners because they've been operating under the assumption that you would have kind of this Missouri Compromise line that would extend out to the west, and that would at least mean, even if California didn't become a slave state, that New Mexico territory would become slave states, and along with the future Oklahoma, hey, we're still continuing to add territory here. So the Wilmot Proviso sails through the House twice, fails in the Senate twice, and of course Polk would have vetoed it if it had gotten to him. Okay, so the Wilmot Proviso is significant because now Southerners start to get defensive and say, wait a minute, you're trying to take this away from us? This is our right to have this land under the Missouri Compromise. Soon they'll overturn the Missouri Compromise. So that's the Wilmot Proviso. The popular sovereignty is a new concept that's introduced by a Southerner named Lewis Cass. And at first it sounds really democratic. It sounds like, hey, each territory should be able to determine for itself if it'll be free or slave. But in reality, it's a Trojan horse because it is simply saying, hey, if any territory, when it's ready to become a state, as a part of its constitutional convention where they drop a state constitution, elect judges and a governor, and do all of these things, part of that they can decide if they're slave or free. Well, that sounds very democratic. It sounds fairly similar to what would be decided in other areas. After all, the Northwest Territory, they'd originally said none of that would be open to slavery. Oregon country has decided it will not be open to slavery. But you do have this unorganized territory, the question mark right here, that's going to become the Kansas and Nebraska territories. This is Minnesota territory and Iowa and Missouri, so don't get confused. But this is going to become the Kansas, Nebraska territories that we'll see in the next video. And this is Utah and New Mexico territories. And they're thinking, hey, New Mexico territory by Missouri Compromise should be slave. But why not allow Utah or this unorganized territory to decide for themselves? So that's the idea of popular sovereignty, and it's going to become a very, very dangerous situation. Well, California statehood, you have the 49ers. And the 49ers, of course, refers to the fact that gold is discovered near the Bay Area, and essentially within a year of discovery of gold being confirmed, so many people have moved to California. California is instantaneously ready to be a state, and it's a little chaotic because they don't have the infrastructure built up, but now they've got all these people and they're trying to form a government, and so California is ready to become a state, and by 1850 it's ready to be approved, and it's going to be a free state. Now this is a problem and precipitates another crisis. Now you should be thinking U.S. history, 1800s, antebellum period. This makes 3 crises that are going to require to have some sort of a compromise to avoid secession happening. Number one, Missouri Compromise. We talked about it a minute ago. Missouri slave, Maine free, results in the Missouri Compromise line moving out to the west at 3630 north latitude. Second is the tariff crisis around the nullification and tariff in 1832, and that gets settled. Who settles both of these? That's right, the daddy of compromise, Henry Clay. Missouri Compromise and the Tariff Compromise of 1833. And now Henry Clay is going to ride to the rescue one last time in kind of his fading time as a politician. And the Compromise of 1850 is what's going to solve this problem, because California was going to upset the sectional balance and mean the North had more free states in the Senate. And this would now permanently upset this, and the Southerners knew they could never catch up in the population in the House of Representatives. So now this would mean total control, and this could precipitate going to war. Remember, everything they did before with South Carolina and the Ordinance of Nullification was about a trial balloon. It's a test case to see if they were going to, someday slavery disappeared, they could have Ordinance of Nullification and secede. So, this is a huge problem. We get the Compromise of 1850. It does 5 things. Number 1, California comes in free. We just talked about that. Number 2, New Mexico and Texas would settle their dispute. Texas was claiming this territory with an X right here was theirs. New Mexico territory, Northerners believed it was theirs. Now, this is a huge implication, because will this land be free or slave? At this time, there were no slaves really in New Mexico territory. Texas is already admitted as a slave state. So there's some implications here. Is it going to just make Texas a bigger state? Is it going to, which would give it more power in the House of Representatives? Or is it going to become part of a new state? Well, basically there were debts Mexico owed to Texas. The United States kind of agrees to settle these damages and take care of the money and pay Texas the money they claimed they were owed in return for this being allowed to go to become part of a different state, which now everyone assumed would become a free New Mexico territory and eventually states. So that settles this boundary dispute between New Mexico area and Texas with the U.S. government in Texas. But then you get the District of Columbia slave trade ending. So they're going to not say that the District of Columbia cannot have any slaves anymore, but they're saying they won't allow any more slave trade. You're not going to be able to bring in more slaves. This would eventually lead it to kind of die out. And remember, Virginia and Maryland that border both sides of the District of Columbia, they both are slave states. So it's natural that it would have had it, but they're saying this is the U.S. capital, we can't have this anymore. So the slave trade is going to fade out. It's going to be ended. Popular sovereignty, this concept we talked about, rears its head again. Now, part of this is Utah and New Mexico territories would be open to popular sovereignty. Now, you might say, but I already told you that New Mexico territory was unlikely to become a slave territory. Well, that is true. I did say that. But here's the problem. Even though that's the case, this is opening up this nightmare scenario where they're even saying land above the Missouri Compromise could be open to slavery. Even if it doesn't happen here, they're opening the possibility and really invalidating the Missouri Compromise. Huge problem for the future. And you'll see this with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and all the problems that come around Kansas. It's basically the possibilities get opened up by popular sovereignty in the New Mexico and Utah territories. The last thing is a stronger fugitive slave law. Stronger fugitive slave law. Okay, so going back to the 1840s, you had a fugitive slave law, and it basically said that slave hunters could come up in northern states and try and find, above the Mason-Dixon line, represented in red here, and they could try and find slaves that had escaped and take them back to the South. But Northerners started to pass something called personal liberty laws, and these were basically saying, by law, no state and local officials in northern states or territories had to help or assist in any way, and they would not assist in any way these slave catchers trying to get back the escaped slaves. And this idea of these slave catchers in the North is going to just really start to break this crack, the schism that's developing. It's going to break it wide open and be such an inflammatory issue. So in the early 1840s, Prigg versus Pennsylvania is a Supreme Court case that basically said the personal liberty laws were okay. And so now it's going to be invalidated by this new, stronger fugitive slave law, which is going to order that Northern officials must assist in the capture. They must help the slave catchers. So they can't be indifferent. They can't refuse to help. They must help. This is a U.S. law supremacy clause. U.S. government law is in the Constitution. They trump state laws. Well, this isn't a part of the Constitution, but it is a U.S. law, and it's from the Supreme Court. So states will have to follow it. And not only that, any Northerner who was found to be harboring these fugitive slaves could be fined or even imprisoned for their assistance of this. So it's tying the hands and forcing the support of federal and Northern officials in these states, and it's also subjecting anyone who's part of the Underground Railroad or helping slaves to major problems. This is a huge issue. So this is going to really anger Northerners, significantly anger Northerners. So you can see there's some things the North gets out of this, some things the South gets out of it. The North is going to be very unsatisfied, even though they take over control of the Senate with California. They're going to be very unsatisfied in the 1850s with both the fugitive slave law and the concept of popular sovereignty. And these things, now we're going full speed ahead at this point toward a civil war eventually happening. The notable thing about the Compromise of 1850 is it does give 10 more years to the North. The North was not that unified. And if you think about stages of unification of the Union, Daniel Webster and the Hayne-Webster debate in 1830 is going to... Hayne is making the Southern viewpoints. Webster really eloquently makes the case for union and the American experiment, and the Union must stay together. And, certainly other people had supported that since then. But what you're going to see is the Compromise of 1850 is then going to give 10 more years for abolitionist fervor to not be radicals and to congeal as major Northern opinion, and the ideas of union to just further cement themselves as, the North just gets more unified as a result of this. So that's a huge win with the Compromise of 1850, is the North's more unified to have the will to fight a long, terrible civil war. The Gadsden Purchase, just tying up a couple loose ends of the early 1850s, they're going to buy, in the mid-1850s, this little area, and the whole point is to have a transcontinental railroad. You have a mountainous region, the end of the Rockies down here in northern Arizona, and they wanted and they wanted to buy this land because it was low land. They thought they could build a transcontinental railroad that would go right into California, and there was a great desire to connect California to the rest of the country. Okay? And then the last thing we have is oh, by the way, Southerners try to see if they can buy Baja California or some more of now northern Mexico. And Northerners are going to be like, what are the limits to what you are trying to get for new territory? This is ridiculous. And Mexico is going to flatly refuse. They sell this little sliver for a lot of money, to allow this railroad. But that's it. And the last one's the Austin Manifesto, which is dealing with Cuba. Southerners were plotting to have kind of a little coup in Cuba, that they would take it over and it would kind of force support, and that Southern presidents could kind of quickly, Southern sympathetic presidents at least, could quickly rubber stamp this and say, yep, we're taking in Cuba. And of course, Cuba, looking where it is, would become a slave state. In this case, probably dealing more with sugar than cotton. But it's yet another attempt, and this starts to be called what Northerners will refer to as a slave power conspiracy of the South. And really what this means is that the Northerners feel like the Supreme Court, controlled by Southerners under Roger Taney, a racist, as well as the attempts by Southern presidents, of which we are frequently having, and just by Southern efforts and exploits to just try and get more land. It doesn't matter where it comes from. Baja California, Cuba, you're eventually going to see William Walker go down to Nicaragua and take it over. And that's a way down here in Central America. Temporarily, he takes that over and tries to get it annexed quickly to the United States. It doesn't happen, and his little coup fails, and he gets executed along with his followers. But Northerners are starting to say there's no limits to what they'll do to expand and continue slavery. And again, at the same time, abolitionist fervor is bubbling up and getting stronger and stronger in the North, to a point where they won't be able to stand neither the expansion of slavery or the maintenance of it. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Stay classy, Sam Barlow.